Transformer is a new series of moderated panel discussions and learning opportunities focused on how cultural organizations, artists, creative technologists, and others are creating compelling digital experiences, engaging audiences, and building resilient strategies and models for the future. Transformer is curated and produced by Root of Two in partnership with Midtown Detroit, Inc. These convenings engage local, national, and international thought leaders over the course of 6 90-minute online Zoom sessions from April through June 2021. Midtown Detroit, Inc. is leading the Detroit Cultural Center Planning Initiative to reimagine the public space that connects a dozen cultural organizations across an 83-acre site. The initiative is developing a place-based digital strategy for the Detroit Cultural Center, designed to build needed infrastructure, advance institutional transformation, and present new models of visitor experiences empowered by technology.
Welcome everyone to the fourth in our series of 6 Transformer Talks. My name is Cezanne Charles and I'm a co-founder and partner at Root of Two. I am also joined by my colleagues John Marshall, who I founded Root of Two with, and Elizabeth Vanderveen, who will be holding down things in chat. Already you've received some prompting about tonight's event, but I just want to remind everyone that if you would like access to the live transcript, just click the live transcript button so that you'll be able to get the captions during the event. Also, I just want to remind everyone that this is really about having live conversations with one another in discussion. So we really want you to get your questions geared up in the chat, and then we will try and get you on screen to sort of be in conversation and in dialogue with our wonderful panelists tonight. So before we get started, I just would like to acknowledge that Root of Two occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of 3 Anishinaabe nations of the Council of Three Fires. They are the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. And while we also understand that a land acknowledgement itself is not enough, we believe it is a first and important step towards supporting Indigenous movements towards self-sovereignty and self-determination. So with that, tonight we are really trying to focus in on the way that both people tied to place can create these kind of participatory experiences in art, and the way that artists working in technology in partnership and in solidarity with organizations and collectives can really help us tell stories differently that maybe have not been told before, and maybe are actually the most important critical ones that exist and persist in our communities. And so we're really excited to talk about the aesthetics and ethics of participation as they apply to art and technology and creative projects in cities. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our amazing panel and just invite them to say a few words about themselves as we get started, and then I'll be back shortly. So thank you so much for joining us.
Hi everyone, my name is Salome Asega. My pronouns are she, her. I'm zooming in today from Brooklyn, New York on Lenape land. I'm a new media artist that uses participatory methodologies to create objects, sculptures, immersive experiences. Right now, a few large corporate entities are actively building a future for us without our consent, and I'm interested in leveraging the power of collective imagination to create counter futures in values of openness and transparency. So alongside my personal practice, I co-founded a space called Power Plant in Brooklyn. It's what we call a digital art collaboratory. We offer sliding scale workshops to adults and teens, all taught by artists that span a range of media and software. We also offer a suite of practical arts training and professional development for artists. So classes like how and why to start an LLC, copywriting, legal basics for artists. I also teach classes at Parsons in the MFA Design and Technology program in critical design and design methodologies. And lastly, I'm in the final weeks of what has been a 4-year technology fellowship at the Ford Foundation, where I've been working closely with the Creativity and Free Expression team and other philanthropic partners to understand the ways artists are making work with and about technology. Something that might be relevant to today's conversation is, I'll put a link into the chat as well, but at the beginning of the pandemic, in thinking about digital transitions, I put together a 5-part digital strategies learning series that started with, I'm just putting the link in the chat, that started by exploring the tools that we already have access to, that many organizations already have access to. So thinking about how to engage audiences remotely through your social media channels or your newsletter, and then slowly integrated things like digital residencies and digital commissioning, and worked our way up to extended reality, AR, VR. And then we also had 2 workshops that specifically focused on the social layers of technology. So understanding power and ethics around the tools that we're using, and also thinking about disability and digital access. So all the recordings are there in the link. So that's where I'll close, and I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have today.
Well, hi everyone. My name is Stephanie Dinkins. I am a transmedia artist who is looking at artificial intelligence primarily, but I think it's also really looking at the future as it relates to, what I claim to be race, aging, gender, and our future histories. I'm working on a number of projects at the moment. One of which is called Binary Calculations Are Inadequate. And this is a big project that has luckily garnered a lot of support. But what we're trying to do is make some databases of care. When you talk to folks who are working in AI and thinking about data and algorithms and ask how they care, or if it's possible for them to care, I often get met with blank stares, or that's not really possible. And my question, and I think the question of my practice a lot of times, is a 2-year-old question, right? The question a 2-year-old might ask: why not? How do we make that happen? Can't we do it? And with that question, I think if I'm going to ask why, then I also have to try. So what happens is me, a person who's technically trained in photography, has been doing video installation for a long time, has jumped into the AI arena as a maker, and really I'm going to say as a tinkerer and crafter, because I don't know what I'm doing. I'm learning as I go along, picking and henpecking, but getting things done. And I think the getting things done is super interesting and full of possibility. I like to explore the space as a person who thinks, hey, this time around, it looks like these AI systems, these algorithms are here to stay. We are going to live among, with, through, be administered by them. So what can we do to make them better companions, better administrators, better carers? I am also the Kasama Professor of Art at Stony Brook University, where I teach digital arts in many forms, and where I'm also starting something called the Future History Studio, where we will be looking at some of these questions, right, with folks we're bringing in to do specifically that, and doing it from an artistic perspective, from a critical perspective, from a computer science perspective. The only thing I ask is that everybody is open and really happy to play, and happy to engage across lines, right? So we all need to be working with each other in one way or another. And that is like a really strange and encapsulated set of my practice. And I super look forward to our conversation as well. And I should say, I'm in Brooklyn too, along with Solomon. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm streaming live from Treaty 1 territory in the homeland, heartland of Métis Nation and the heart of Turtle Island. And I do want to kind of express my concerns. We just recently found 215 unmarked graves of children from residential schools. And right now in the country, as we come to Indigenous Month and Indigenous Day, we're in kind of a serious set of mourning. And so I wasn't really quite sure if I was going to do the talk today. And I thought it would be more important for our voices to be elevated, and in particular to an American audience to be reminded of the kind of colonialism and imperialism that happened right across Turtle Island, and in particular the severity of residential schools here in Canada, and which led to the apartheid system in South Africa, and this kind of larger conversation around slavery and colonialism that are so deeply intertwined, that's where we come from. And I think that it's kind of important to note that. So I just want to start there. I am a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Arts, Digital Media, and Collaboration at the University of Winnipeg. And that's my, I guess, my full-time real job. And as part of that, I do artistic practice and some curatorial practice and research creation, and a lot of scholarship around writing about thinking about concealed geographies, space and place, digital media. And we've just opened up an Indigenous digital media space and an Indigenous Collaborative Research Center, which is over 4,000 square feet, taking over a huge chunk of the floor in one of the buildings at the University of Winnipeg. And we've been able to kind of intertwine media, old media, which I kind of say is this kind of long thread of history. So, you know, technologies were always new technologies. So how we used to bead and tuft and sew, which are things that we still do today, those were new technologies in their moment of time. And so we have a big focus on that. And at the same time, we look at AR and VR, interactive media, all kinds of fun stuff, 3D printing, green screens, video games, all kinds of activities that sometimes outweigh my own mental capacity. The picture that you see is actually my work at Nuit Blanche in 2017, where I was a commissioned artist as part of Manitowoc. This piece was called Manitowoc Speaking to the Moon. And it was 3 built wigwam constructed pieces that were 16 feet in diameter and about 6 feet in height. And they were kind of wrapped 360 projections with a 360 binaural sound work that went with it, and thinking a lot about the importance of that kind of interstitial space between the spot where the sky world and the ground world kind of sits, where the creator sits. And so I was really interested in kind of bringing a love song to Manitoba. And that word actually means great spirit and sacred water in the Cree dialect. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, yeah, I guess I should talk about Nuit Blanche. I am the inaugural artistic director for Nuit Blanche, and I just saw my child sitting at the door trying to get in. I am the first director for the North America's largest public exhibition. We usually draw about 1.2 million people across the city of Toronto. And in 2020, we did our first ever virtual Nuit Blanche, where we brought together 55 BIPOC artists and looked at, we had Nuit in Your Neighborhood, which was augmented reality and virtual reality. We had a live stream where we streamed about 30 different artists, a 14-year archive, and podcasts and talks like we're doing today. I was kind of, anyways, I think that I'll stop there, and I'll happily take some questions later, and we can have a really good dialogue, which I'm looking forward to. Chimigwich, Marcy, thank you for having me.
Hello, my name is Roddy Schrock. I'm the executive director of Ivy. I'm not an artist, but I run an organization that aspires to support the types of artists that have introduced themselves already, as well as many others. And to give you a little background about the organization, we've been around for about 20 years, and from the beginning, our mission has been to support artists that are creatively engaging with technology as well as inventing technology. And I think, you know, as time has changed, society has changed, technology has changed, or the world's relationship to technology has changed. So the organization has tried to be very responsive to those changes and maintained a values first approach to all of the work that we support. Our values are openness, invention, and justice. And so we've always seen a gap in support, in the type of support provided to artists like Salome and Stephanie and others that are working towards the public good in their engagement with technology. And as I mentioned, oftentimes invention even of new technologies. I think as the world more and more wakes up to the dangers of sort of blindly following Silicon Valley directed research and development, that the need for a kind of reckoning of what we actually want technology to do for us and not to us is probably one of the most important questions of our time. And one of the things that we strongly believe at iBeam is that artists actually provide insights not only into how that relationship could evolve into a better place, but as importantly, artists are able to create space for imagination so that we can actually have those moments to contemplate as a culture and as societies throughout the world, to contemplate and digest the sort of radical changes that we're all undergoing both internally and collectively due to our relationship with technology. At the beginning of the pandemic last year, we were getting ready to put our open call out for our annual residency program, which is really our flagship support program for artists. We kind of, metaphorically threw our hands in the air and asked ourselves, like, what are we going to do when the physical space that we typically provide to artists is not available? Do we go dark for a while? Do we kind of rethink things? And we just decided to move to a fully digital fellowship. And that provided a lot of opportunities for us to learn as an organization. We ended up supporting 30 artists from 3 continents for the year. Incredible new projects were developed out of that. I encourage you to go to ibeam.org to see some of the work that came from that program. And I think in the process, it really pushed us as an organization to really reimagine what our role could be if we were to even be a little more ambitious about what a digital first fellowship could mean, and then growing into a responsive kind of hybrid relationship to physical gatherings as time passed. And so we're in the process of planning a 3-year program that aims to support 75 artists in that kind of approach. And by support, I mean cash awards of up to typically $20,000 each, professional development, artist services that range from budget training to marketing to press relations. And again, really building from this idea that there's a whole world of creative practitioners that are talented in a way that needs nurturing outside of typically commercial forms of support. And we're trying to build an organization that can model what that looks like. So to what both Salome, Stephanie, and Julie were saying, that there can be a move towards art and technology that is for the public good, which is something that we see more and more of both a need and a desire for, actually. So I'll just stop there. And I look forward to the dialogue with the rest of the group in a few minutes. And I too am in Brooklyn, so it's good to be here.
So just as a reminder, everyone start getting your questions in the chat, but I am going to take my advantage and just ask the first question. And so, one of the things that, I found really interesting about the kind of connections between everyone's work is the way that, it's often about how you create these spaces and opportunities for agency, whether it's through sort of organization building, collective building, or works that really sort of look to uncover the role of who has agency or not within a particular system or project. So I wondered if you could all maybe speak briefly to this idea of how does that touch on the immediacy of the past year, the current moment, and as you're looking forward, how does this theme or this idea of agency really play out in the kind of work you're trying to take on and move forward? We'll send it to Salome first.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm curious to hear Stephanie's answer as well. And, just as an artist who has a critical bend or a critical lens to exploring, the challenges and implications of technology in society, the question that often comes up is, do you hate tech? Like what? And it's not that I hate tech, it's that I have quite these very serious questions around power. And so, and who has power and how to redistribute power. And so when I hear your question, I'm just thinking about what is at the root of the work we do. And it's about this power redistribution.
Yeah, I would jump in. Thanks, Salome. That was great. I think a lot about power, right? And value, and where we place value, where it comes from, and how we take it and make it for ourselves versus having it assigned or not to us as individuals. So I think a lot about agency and how we kind of make, in the face of, the constrictions, whether it be the kind of lockdown of COVID, whether it be, BLM, like all the things that we're watching right now, whether it be a set of algorithms that are acting every day that we hardly recognize, but have really great impact on us. And the question for me is, well, okay, if there's this imbalance of power, but we still have to function in these spaces, how do we find the wherewithal, right, to actually be able to A, survive and just feel okay, B, thrive, right, and find ways to, whether overtly, covertly, or something in the middle, make space to understand our own value and try to make sure that the world understands that value as well, right? And that's where I'm trying to make space, is the space of value where, maybe we can all find our value in a very particular way and have it also taken as a thing, which I think is that play on ideas of power and how then power has to work around and see and regard us, and how we interrupt power, and what that actually means to interrupt power. I'm not quite sure.
I mean, I can happily pick up on that. There's two things I think is that, we've done a lot of decolonial work and work around indigenizing particular spaces. And I think that, it means people have to give up their power in order to, and think about how those existing structures happen in those institutions in really intentional and particular ways to kind of continue to reassert power over and over again. And if I get another question of, I don't know why we've just only had this body of applicants and we can't actually get anybody like you. Are you a unicorn? Are you the exception? Are you the anomaly? And I think in my head, I'm like, no, that you actually just need to actually do the work to make it attractive for people to want to come, to know that that's a space that's going to be having you at the table and hearing your voice. And I think that, I was also exhausted at the start of the pandemic of being asked constantly. It's like, oh, wow, we've just got this incredible opportunity. And all of a sudden, all these institutions have this light bulb moment where they're like, oh my God, this whole world is, how do you feel? And I was like, some of us have been doing this work for fucking over 20 years. And we stand on the shoulders of people who have actually been doing that work for another 50 years and them the same back and forth. And so I think that, there's a couple of things there where I think that it's like people have to be okay to let go of their power. It's fine for people to all of a sudden have a moment of a realization, of an epiphany that the world has unequal distribution of wealth and that there's there's actual power dynamics at play. But I think that there needs to also be a realization that for a lot of us, that work has been starting since birth. And, and we carry that with us everywhere we go. And we also carry the trauma and the experiences of our family members prior to us and them prior to them. And I think that, I think that people so easily forget, and this kind of like moment, and I think we're in that right now in Canada in terms of like support and conversation, similar to Black Lives Matter, for you guys from last summer, but it's like, this isn't, this isn't new information. Residential schools isn't something that's all of a sudden been, you should actually know it had existed. We've been going through the Truth and Reconciliation since 2015. And so we're supposed to be in this moment of reconciliation, yet we're not. And I think that, I think that there's so much there. And I think that people have lots of time on their hands because they're in lockdown or stuck in their places. But I think that, I think that it will be good to kind of continue that work, but I think we need to acknowledge all of the people that have been doing that work for a really long time, pre-lockdown or pre-understanding of this kind of political epiphany. So I'll have lots more to say. There's lots more to chat about.
I think picking up on this very idea, like the idea of participation often sort of conjures to mind the idea of both hosting and welcome. And there is a sort of power exchange in that sort of relationship. So I wonder how you sort of create that sort of sense of we're going to be in dialogue with one another through these works, through these, opportunities, and how you sort of welcome the necessary tension. Like, how do you sort of set those stages? Like, if we're just going to really think about the two ends of hosting and welcome and setting the stages for these things. I will send it to Roddy this time.
Thank you. And I'm really coming to this as an organizational leader, and that's I spend a lot of time thinking about organizational structure, organizational functions, and I appreciate what Julie was saying, because it's that kind of work that even allows and pushes organizations to actually think differently and a little more creatively about its relationship to power. And while it's, I think organizations like I-Beam have done so much to really help so many artists reach new stages of their career and produce their work. At the end of the day, I think for myself and so many colleagues in other organizations, there's a real kind of a existential analysis about what the role of organizations are right now, and particularly to that question of power and gatekeeping. And while, I'm really happy that my team reads, 500 applications during an open call season, and we're still making decisions along with our jury around, who gets supported, who gets elevated, whose voices are heard, who gets funding, and so forth. And it's something that has really kind of, especially in this past year, has really, I think, forced all of us to kind of do a little bit of a double take as to our complicity and agency, potential agency in creating a better model. And so for the next 3 years, we're going to try something different. We're actually going to turn the keys of our fellowship over to our fellows. We're calling it fractal fellowships, and it's based on that organic idea of sort of organic and self-propelled selection and growth, such that we're bringing in 5 fellows to begin with at the end of this year, who we'll then work closely with in supporting and thinking of ourselves as a container for their work and a support mechanism for their work. But once they've decided what the fellowship should look like for the subsequent phases, the next 3 phases over the next 2.5 years, we're hands off. I mean, it's really, we'll provide professional development, we'll provide financial support, but the idea is that we want to set the table and provide the necessary tools for a group of practitioners to actually develop the model for additional funding going forward. And that involves everything from us working for a design studio for social impact to help us as evaluators, Center for Artistic Activism to do trainings around activism and art within technology, as well as, today we're talking about bringing in someone from the Quaker social justice field to help the fellows learn about collaborative decision making as they kind of develop what this model will look like. But essentially, yeah, once that train leaves the station, we'll be there to help it, but no longer will we be the ones who are deciding what the actual structure, will be, because it seems like this is the moment to actually experiment with new forms of governance and funding, and hopefully will lead us to outcomes that can help other organizations learn from this type of approach as well. So it's a big experiment, and we're very, very excited about it. And you know, the big world is probably a small action, but we feel like it's at least a way for us to respond to these highly urgent questions around power.
Stephanie or Julie or Salome, do you have thoughts on this kind of tension between both the need to sort of redistribute power, but then the way that you also have to balance kind of welcoming and participation in hosting, and kind of the care and ethics around hosting as you go about sort of building these new projects and work as well?
I'll say as an artist, like, I'm very much interested in participation as a decision-making tool, and there are many tools in that toolbox, right? And so, you know, participation happens on a scale, and it's about right-sizing the structure for what makes sense for that project, you know. And so for me, I'm very, very much interested in cooperative models. And so whenever I start a project that is, most of my projects are place-based, and some of those places are not my own homes, right? So when I start those projects, I, you know, even if we've had one call with the partners and there's only like one brainstorming sheet, I've created a whole folder and file structure system for us to organize that information, because the information needs to be cooperatively accessible, right? Like, if I was to leave this project tomorrow, like, it could still live without me. And so I'm very much interested in that kind of level of participation. But again, that doesn't make sense, and not everyone wants that much power. Like, you need to also, you know, some people want to be able to dip in and dip out. And so it's about scaffolding what makes sense for the project.
Yeah, and I'm one of those people who wants to dip in and dip out, right? Which is kind of funny. So I run AI assemblies, and they gather people, like, say 20 to 30 people. And I'm always floored that people don't want to leave. And I'm always trying to figure out, well, why don't people want to leave these things? And it is about the hosting and welcoming. And we center play. We take it slow. Like, we do things that, you know, some people in the room get upset because it's so slow that it's crazy, but it also makes some synergies. And we also encourage folks to interact with each other directly. So at the AI assembly we held at Ford Foundation, it was great. We had everybody interview each other. So participants interviewed each other for like 10 minutes in front of everybody else. And it was fabulous. It took forever. It maybe gave us a little bit of a left field off of what we were doing. And I can't really define what we were doing, but it created some very strong bonds. It allowed us to think in ways that, and I'm going to say a word I don't really like. It felt a little magical, like things happened in the room that allowed for this kind of churn that people carry to this day. And that was like a year and a half ago or 2 years. And so I'm always trying to figure out how you open spaces for people to communicate with each other, get to know each other, and pivot off of whatever it is their seat of power is, right? So I believe in discomfort too. And lateral work, right? So once you're in an AI assembly room, I think we are all equals, no matter who you may be. And we usually have like the spectrum of, you know, very high level mathematician to junior in college just trying to get their feet wet. But we're all equal, we're just discussing things. And that seems to be really amazing in the terms of hosting too. So distributing power, right? And working towards a collaboration, and then trying to make that be, you know, self-sustaining. Because once I have these things, I walk away. I purposely don't hold them on a constant basis. I refuse to kind of name the organization in a hard way, because really I hope that people walk away from these things feeling that they, in particular, are empowered to be in the world in a very, whatever way they need to be, rather in a way that has to always come back to center. So trying to give people that core to walk with and peers to do it with.
I was just going to say that to answer your question, it just depends on which hat you're wearing. So for me, if I'm an artist and I'm hosting and I'm thinking about the kinds of things that I want to communicate to the public and how I do that, and what kind of narrative I'm kind of creating visually, I think that's very different than, say, I ran in 9 different countries across the world, and we talk and looking about shared colonial histories across those countries and how public art and digital media can transform some of those spaces and conversations. So that is really different when I'm hosting those kind of conversations, because they're quite large and really kind of incredible, and there are people coming at it from really diverse histories from each of their specific regions and spaces and nations. When I make a work, how people interpret that work, or even how Stephanie said in a workshop, your strategies and methodologies are very different based on what it is that you're trying to do. And I think that, the question is hard because there's not one way of doing things. And I would say for me, a lot of the work is collaborative. A lot of the work is decentralizing the individual author or the individual artist, or the kind of Eurocentric version of that there's one master narrative of X. And I think that, for a lot of the work, the collaboration, the kind of deep listening, the kind of end up doing that kind of really hard labor that only happens with long, not just be about extraction. They need to have a kind of ebb and flow, and they need to be reciprocal.
So we have our first questioner of the evening, aside from me. So I'd like to welcome Matt onto screen with us in order to ask his question. Thanks for joining us, Matt.
Oh, thanks for just this discussion has just been so eye-opening. I've got like half a dozen terms that I have to look up after our video call today. I didn't even know what things like concealed geography were. So it's been interesting, and I'm the director of finance for the Detroit Historical Museum, and our mission is to tell Detroit's story and why it matters. And we certainly have learned over the last several years that our exhibit, for instance, that says the start of Detroit was in 1701, we now know from our population that, of course, it started long before 1701. And so that's an example of, the Eurocentric museum landscape. But, my question is more basic. As a director of finance, certainly with the pandemic in particular, where so many resources are being shifted to other areas than cultural support, I'm hearing all of this forward-looking, innovative, collaborative discussion about projects and installations. I mean, I love seeing the installation, Julie, that you showed us. And I think about how do we pay for it? I mean, that's the I deal with traditional funders and certainly individual constituents and their individual philanthropy. And I'm not sure, I don't know how to paint a vision that would, go beyond, some of the largest foundations, and how do we get them to be engaged at a level of financial support? Because when I'm hearing all of this, I'm thinking about costs and about, what does it cost to engage people at all these different levels, and what does it cost to really, get them to participate in support of some of these new initiatives that are so broad. And so, yeah, that's my question. How do we pay for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think particularly, how do you pay for these things that can be long form, they can be multi-institution, and particularly, how do you sort of rethink that relationship? We sort of talk in organizing circles that everything moves at the speed of trust, and maybe in nonprofit circles, everything moves at the speed of donors, maybe funders, and maybe boards. So maybe we could talk a little bit about the way that you sort of resourced or funded these kind of new initiatives or these long form projects that you're working on as either artists or organizers. Thank you so much, Matt.
So in the Canadian context, I think there's some things I would say that are really important. And in decolonizing and indigenizing and dismantling structures is actually not that difficult in terms of cost. It's actually strategic hires and thinking about those strategic hires at all levels of your organization. So as soon as you have an opportunity to come up, you start strategically hiring in terms of to shift the kind of diversity that's happening within your space. And that's actually a really cost-effective way of like creating change within your institutions. And then the kind of didactic change that you're talking about within your kind of museum space comes with those new staff and new people working, but you just can't. In Canada, what has happened for a long period of time with galleries and museums, it was always about cash grabs. So like, oh, we need a BIPOC person or an Indigenous person to do this thing. And so we would just like apply for this grant, give them this little crappy opportunity of precarious labor, and then hope that they'll fix all of the problems that happen within your institution. And I'd say that, you know, when we restructured and did a lot of work at the University of Winnipeg and the Winnipeg Art Gallery, you know, we're kind of leading the way in some aspects because we made sure that we had Indigenous representation at the director, well, not the director, the CEO is one person, the director or head of Indigenous initiatives, making sure there's people in education, making sure there's people in curatorial, making sure there's people in security, making sure that there's people at the front of house so that people feel welcomed and happy to be there. And so, you know, those are kind of, you know, long-term decisions of strategic hires that you can make that can radically shift your institution really cost effectively. I know when I presented in 2016, the indigenization plan to the entire staff and volunteers of the Winnipeg Art Gallery, a person asked me your specific question, how much is this going to cost us? And in the end, I think that how much does it cost us as a society if we don't do it? And so that was my kind of like response back is that, and in fact, at that point, we hadn't spent any money and we'd already been doing all this work. And so I think that having a kind of strategic vision about how you want to shift your institution and working in partnership and collaboration with people who can help do that work with you, strategic hires, then you can go after sponsors and donors that are really key and excited about the kind of critical shift that needs to happen. And I think it's showing those kind of philanthropists, you know, that there's a real opportunity to be seized, that you can be a leader in the field or think about X, Y, and Z. And I think that, you know, on the flip side, within the university system, for me as a scholar, you know, we have access to federal funds. You know, the partnership grant that I was talking about is a $2.5 million project. And then the overall project is just over $6 million over 7 years with all the partner institutions. And so because I'm a scholar at a university, I have access to different kinds of funding, but those kinds of opportunities to work with scholars and cultural workers and professionals within the field can really allow new opportunities. So, you know, we have an Indigenous Advisory Circle. I co-chair it with an incredible colleague of mine, Dr. Heather Agugliorte. And, you know, we've been able to kind of push those conversations with the help of all of the people that work at the Winnipeg Art Gallery at all the different levels. But we can bring new kinds of conversations to that institution without any repercussions because we don't actually work there.
Salome, Stephanie, Roddy, other thoughts around how you finance new initiatives, make things work, pull people along even when their money doesn't want to come? That could also be the subject of the talk.
Immediately what came to mind is there's another IBEAM alum artist named American Artist who a couple months ago made this meme that said, the digital commission might cost you more than the real life show. And I think the second reading of that meme is that there is in the year we've had, there's been a rise in digital commissioning and digital residencies, which is exciting. It's creating more opportunities for artists. But the budgets are really low for those things. So in seeing that meme, the second reading is that there's a kind of devaluing or sense that digital projects are cheaper, you know, to produce. And, but, you know, still require all the same artistic, emotional, intellectual labor. So, but I think the flip to that is, you know, I think for me, I'll just speak individually as an artist, there's always been kind of I've always felt like a little too techy for the arts organization. So when an opportunity comes my way, it's always been kind of like, well, how much, what's your budget, and I'll make it work, and that's true of a lot of people I know in my community. And so I think that maybe hopefully what we need to do on our end is also start to create and learn how to do this, create more honest budgets for our work. Because you'll see budgets for new media projects, and they are like, the scale is, the same thing can happen at all scales, this. So I think that's kind of the next thing that needs to happen. And then also, NEA, Knight Foundation and Ford Foundation came together to produce this art and tech landscape study. And in that report, there's a section that gives recommendations to arts organizations, funders, it's by group for how to support this kind of practice. And that report will be released publicly June 29th. Unfortunately, there isn't like a link for it right now, but I will make sure to pass it on to Root of Two.
Salome, I love what you were just saying. And, I think one of the things that was kind of coming up also with what Julie was saying was just this notion of partnerships and coalition building. And I mean, that's something that we're really leaning into a lot as an organization at the moment, is just finding those other organizations that actually share your values, even if there might be different outcomes in different ways. But if you start there and try to build dialogue that can help all partners learn from each other as well in the process, you can really, I think what I really learned last year is just seeing so many organizations come together and actually jointly fundraise. To get back to your question, Matt, it really kind of opened something up to me in terms of what possibilities might be for organizations to actually build those coalitions and acknowledge and celebrate the differences between them, but also the similarities. I think that makes it oftentimes easier for funders, because it doesn't feel as though there's so much, that actually their job is easier. And it also, I think, just in terms of learning opportunities for the different groups that come together, there's real potential there. And I that's one of the things I kind of am coming out of this last year feeling most excited about. Is okay, so how do we actually build on these kind of coalition partnership opportunities that sort of emerged organically in the last year, and sort of and not forget that happened, and go back to just the old kind of all of us sort of fighting for the same few bucks here and there. Let's actually collectively think about how many artists and how many projects we could support, and find those gaps in what each other does and help fill them in, and synergistically really create a new model of what funding could look like. And I know that's sounds a little Pollyannish, but I'm holding on to the dream. I really think that's so important for us to come out of this and really remember that is a possibility. It doesn't have to be the way that it is, at least in the United States. It doesn't have to be this way. There are other ways it could function, and that makes me feel hopeful, for what we hopefully learned in this last
Wow.
week.
I love the Pollyanna, Roddy. Just that dream, or that dreaming into what's possible, which is something I think about a lot. How do we do it differently? I feel like I often find myself getting in a little bit of trouble, because I feel like I'm preaching to people to okay, thank you very much for giving me this money, but how do we do this a little bit differently? And I'm going to say that right now, as an artist, I am the beneficiary of a lot of funding. I feel super fortunate. At the same time, I'm like, oh man, is there just a crazy shorthand that's going on right now? Because it constantly comes back to the same spaces, and if you watch it, you can see it. And the question becomes, well, how do we spread the wealth so that multiple people can enjoy the space of creation with feeling comfortable and not having to shift their budgets to go, well, I can, if you give me X, Y, or Z, I can do it. I can get it done. It might be this or the other, but how do we make it a little bit better? One of my solutions is knowing, that I just feel like I'm the beneficiary of a convergence of a few things that have allowed this for me. But then B, how do I make opportunities and sustain others with what I have? Which is both an amazing opportunity for me and I enjoy doing it, but daunting because now I'm like, oh, I'm employing people and helping other people. What happens if it all just dries up? Like, then you have this whole other world of thinking about, oh gosh, how do I sustain this beyond the idea where people are interested in AI and art and technology in this way, right? Because I'm sure at some point it's just going to go, oh, okay, we're on to something else, which is also something I hope for, right? Like, how do we get people not to be on to the next thing? And thinking more holistically about the ecosystems that we have, right? In terms of what a funder's impact is. Like if it's education this year and algorithms in 2 years, like what does that do? And how is there a continuity across those spaces as opposed to jumping, right, from one to the other? But, I also say though, apply, like, that same old game, especially for artists. I've talked to folks often who are like, well, I didn't get something. So I guess I'll never get it. And then I will say to them things like, well, I got a creative capital grant, but I applied for that thing, I think at least 4 times. And I know that they were following me because people have told me that my first application was a worthwhile place because it informed them and there's a trajectory that followed in them watching me, which I think is also on a ground level for artists, just something to keep in mind. Like it's a process.
That was super great. I feel like we did a really deep dive into the way that both partnership, collaboration, funding, remembering that you have access to friends and partners, don't do this alone. I think that also could have been the subtext for the entire Transformer series. But I also want to talk about this very thing that Stephanie just brought up, which is this kind of attention economy, right? Like that we're all sort of having to deal with both in good ways and bad ways in terms of the way that it has focused a lot of arts organizations' attention onto sort of digital transformation and trying to immediately look for who are their allies, who are their peers, who are their funders in this space, when maybe they didn't have a sort of track record or a trajectory kind of in new media or art and technology. So if you could just talk a little bit about like what it's been like to sort of discover or work with arts organizations or others that are kind of new to the space, that are maybe trying to figure out how to come into this space as a good partner or as a good actor, in terms of just, again, touching back on that idea of like, how are we building sort of bridges around participation in this work? I will send it, I think, to Stephanie first this time.
Ooh, that's the hard position, right? I think there are a lot of good actors out there. I think that, and NEA thing that Salome just brought up, I got to participate in some of those back and forth, and it was really useful. And there were a lot of the people thinking through what and how we can do it. And that's wonderful, right? Like actually the convenings, the I-Beam convenings, right? The whole, the initiative over COVID was amazing, right? And so how do we keep stitching these things together in this way? Becomes the question for me. Roddy, I think your comments earlier about not forgetting are super important. Like it scares me how quickly we are going to forget what these times were or shift the way that we're thinking about things for expediency or for what's available and allowed. And I wonder, like, how do we create a memory? How do, once we have all these people in a room talking about things, continue to build on it when, the urgency of all the social and medical and various other conditions are not upon us? And what kind of coalitions do we need there?
It terrifies me, Stephanie, to think about what forgetting might mean at this moment. I totally hear you. And I kind of feel the world sort of just, asking itself, what pandemic? As we sort of just reopens and wait. But, I was also just going to very quickly add that in terms of just opening up to kind of new partners that are joining, the media arts world and so forth. I am so welcoming to that. I feel like for so long, media arts and digital arts have kind of, it's almost lived in a hermetic space, a little bit outside of the lived experience of most of the world. And to me, it's like a breath of fresh air, and it's oxygen, and it's sunshine, and it's good tension, it's good awkward conversations, it's learning, it's all of those things. And I think that is, as long as we continue good faith dialogue and just build on those relationships, then that, to me, it's one of the best things that's happened to the digital arts field in a very long time, in my opinion. So I think it's only going to lead to a better place eventually.
We have our next questioner up. Joining us is Chris Barr.
Hey friends, how are you?
Hello.
Glad to be in conversation with you. I thought I'd lob a question to you all. I know this panel is a bit on ethics, and underneath ethics is a layer of trust. So many cultural institutions are dealing with how do we move into the technology space responsibly without having a ton of savvy within their organizations about knowing who to trust. And that includes big tech. And I see a lot of efforts by big technology companies to partner with institutions in ways that don't always benefit the cultural institutions that they might be working with. They benefit the reputation of the technology companies, certainly. But I'm curious, what advice would you all give on who to trust, especially when thinking about partnerships, and how to ensure that the interests of the cultural institutions, artists, and others are really being cared for as they move into technology partnerships?
You know, this is a question Chris and I are starting to jam on. So I think for me, if you're an arts organization or an artist that has a very clear, like, time-stamped project, there is a closing date to it, you know what you want to get out of it, then it makes sense maybe to partner with a larger tech entity. But I've heard from many arts organizations that have pursued that kind of partnership that it feels really rocky and it feels unstable, and it's unsustainable, right? Like the project isn't long lasting. But those are, you know, certain experiences, you know, I know of. So for me, it's just, I would say go into it hesitantly and have like a very clear sense of what you want to get out of it.
I guess from the perspective of one of those of a cultural organization that is interested in engaging digital, you know, my thought would be, well, my dream for iBeam has always been that it could be a space for actually people to come and learn about technology without the kind of big tech sort of bias that might exist otherwise, and to have a space wherein people can visit a home for artists rather than sort of sending artists out to corporations and that don't really know how to support the artists most of the time. You know, like kind of flipping that on its head has always been kind of a way of dreaming of what an organization like iBeam could be. But I think that to directly get back to what you're saying, Chris, that to me, both of those scenarios are about finding artists that you trust. And there are so many artists that are extraordinarily talented digital practitioners. I think bringing that question back to the artist could be at least a start down a path, if not a paved road. It could like show some paths towards building a trusted relationship with a tech company or a corporation or a developer or something along those lines. But, you know, I mean, even on the screen tonight, we have, you know, trusted voices working in technology that I think most cultural institutions would do very well by speaking to learn about what the field of possibilities might be out there, because there's 3,000 different options for pretty much any, you know, technology need that a cultural institution might have. So I guess, yeah, short answer would be like, if there's a way to try to bring it back to the artists as a trusted advisor in that conversation feels like a way forward, perhaps.
I think that your question is tough. And I think that partly because if I think about, Nuit Blanche in the city of Toronto and Nuit being like the largest public exhibition, they're in conversations with Google to have this like particular platform so that we can launch more of our AR and VR works easily. But the reality is that, people like at Urban Shaman here in the city, which is a artist-run Indigenous gallery, their 360 shots that they shot on the 360 camera that they hired a person to do look better. And so I'm kind of like, in my mind, I'm like, is it worth it? Like, I don't know. And I would say that the fact that we actually, for Nuit, we did Nuit in your neighborhood, and we had 23 VR AR works. And you didn't have to have an app. All you did was click and it automatically uploaded to your phone, and you could play with it and shrink it and hide it and, put it in your hand or wear it. And I just feel like, I don't know if we needed them, if that makes any sense. So I feel like there's this desire to want that kind of stuff. And, I did a talk with Collision, and they're like a massive deal in terms of tech industry, but I feel like there wasn't much in terms of conversation of actually knowing that the work that we did or who I was or any of the kind of background research that actually is the kind of thing that you need to have trust in order to even come on and be part of this conversation. So for me, as the interloper from the person in the Northern Hemisphere, I feel like I looked up Cezanne's organization. I wanted to know what it was that you guys were doing. Do you know what I mean? And I'm like, I don't want to just do a talk for no reason. And I also definitely don't put in a position where I'm going to be compromised, whether that's extractive or whether that's about trying to broker the relationship between an artist and a major institution. It's like literally the worst position to be put in, because, for Nuit 2020, I did all of that work. We launched a 14-year archive, 55 artists, 23 of those, the AR VRs, another 30 of them on kind of like live feed. We did 45 people talks. I did 10 podcasts with over 50 people. You know what I mean? And we did that all, we organized that all in 8 weeks. And I just think in my head, and partly was able to do it was because I'd worked with all of those artists before. And so like one of the artists, I'm going to quote Jean Marshall because she's the sweetest. She was like, I had no idea what you wanted to do with my beadwork. Like she was just like, I love you. I trust you. I know you're going to do something great. And we literally 3D rendered a beadwork that we were able to put on Lake Superior right across the entire lake, which was amazing and stunning. And everybody was like, did you use noodles? How did you make it look like your beadwork? Like people had so many questions. And I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like, we want all of these things because they seem attractive. It's kind of like, like the grass is greener over there and Google's better or another tech company's better. But in fact, if we just look right beside us, there's these really incredible people that are working in the field for long periods of time that can mobilize and do this work so incredibly. And the example with Urban Shaman, like their 360 viewing pieces were amazing. And we're talking like artist run center with very little resources. So I feel like, and I feel like they did a better job than some of the big institutions, which I'm not going to name.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's really critical here, and maybe like Stephanie, you can talk to this, but if part of what you're working on is really to try and shift the sort of dominant practices of big tech, then how do you sort of find yourself having to have and hold these kind of conversations, these relationships, just in order to sort of be able to do the necessary work that you're trying to call for?
Suzanne, that's super interesting. And I find myself inside and outside often. And it's really interesting because, Julie, I love that kind of trust that you're talking about, right? That relational trust from person to person. You understand small organizations pulling on what they're doing. That to me is trust, because I'm like, oh, when I step into a big company, I don't think it's about trust, and I have trouble finding the idea of trust. And wonder what will come out of it, although curiosity usually wins in my case. So I wind up on the inside trying to figure out what's going on, how you pull it apart, and what's possible. And I also think that often in like big places like academia working on big AI problems, corporate spaces, like my mere presence changes things, which is a shame, right? But it actually changes the way that people have to kind of process. And I'm not saying it changes. I think it's a tiny modicum of a change, but I think it's a worthy change. So I find myself in spaces all the time where I'm like, well, okay, I will do this. I think I've been prepared for my whole life to do this. I don't really trust it, but I think that I will learn some things. I think they will learn some things, and maybe my project will move forward in some way, right? Because a lot of the projects I'm working on take, or hypothetically take, big processing, big power, and brains who know the stuff better than I do. However, I always come back to my work. It's so funny. Like, I tend to like throw away the stuff that we've done because they're regularizing in lots of ways. And that's what I'm trying to get them not to do. But even that struggle of like, okay, how do we not make this sound like everything else in terms of a chatbot? How do we tweak it so that it has ethos and values that are different, right? And I feel like any engineer that I poke and prod with that question and then offer them things that they haven't heard of or thought about becomes a tiny crack in their armor. And that's why I do it, but I hardly ever find it a trustful space. But I'm of the thought that we're in this world that, yeah, as I said in the beginning, this is what's happening in our world. I'm frightened about people being left so far behind that we never catch up to help construct these spaces. And so I'm willing to take those steps. But it's hardly ever about trust.
Thank you so much, Chris, for that excellent question. And thank you so much to our panelists as well. I think that there's like this real kind of conversation around like doing the trustful work and the needful work. Around like how do you sort of like bring technology both into kind of both cultural spaces and cultural domains, but more specifically, how do you use technology to come of, to uncover sort of histories of indebtedness and histories of care that we need to sort of talk about. So I wonder if we could maybe talk a little bit about just that very thing. I mean, all of you in some way, shape or form talk about kind of the histories and stories of folks that have needed to sort of be uplifted and told. And you're choosing to specifically engage in technology as the medium to do that. So how does technology in and of itself like begin to sort of really shift that work, I think. And I will kick things off, I think, with Salome this time.
For me, in my practice, I'm pretty medium agnostic. So I start with story and people and place first. And then I figure out like what are the best tools through that collaborative process to that, to tell that story. And so, in some cases, that means that like tech becomes like the amplifier, like the way to reach more people. And sometimes it's a way of creating really tiny, intimate experiences that require someone to get really close to something. So, I think that for me, it's starting with people, place, and again, story first.
Roddy?
I'm just going to build on what she's saying, because I was like, I couldn't have said it more articulately. It's exactly that. It's like the technology doesn't drive the project, that it's actually the concept, the narrative, space and place, the grounding of who you are, who's telling the story. And then I start looking for the technology that's best going to do that narrative for me. So whether that's like starting in an animation, or whether that's using 360 binaural sound, whether that's using triggers, whether that's using augmented reality, it's just really, for me, it's about how can I recreate this feeling, this immersive feeling through technology. And the technology doesn't dictate the work that we're doing. And I would say that I brought the first Indigenous delegation with the Indigenous Screen Office and the MIT Co-Creation Lab to MIT. And I would say the biggest fundamental difference with all of the Indigenous delegation and the MIT folks, and not everybody, but there was a real disconnect in terms of technology driving the kind of narrative, or like the desire to want to continue to work in that kind of technology to push the technology. And I would say that, you know, in other art projects that I was involved in 2013, there was a big project called Landslide Possible Futures. And there were two different academics that were at the helm, and one really encouraged us to explore older technologies or really think about the story that we wanted to tell and how we wanted to tell it. Whereas the other group of artists, there were a lot of people that were really interested in, it's like, oh, I found this new gadget. I want to push the boundaries of this gadget. And I would say, for me, I call those decolonial tools. And so I see technology as a decolonial tool. So something that I use in order to retell or recreate or transform a story. So I really wanted to build on what you're saying, because I couldn't agree more.
Roddy?
Yeah, I mean, this conversation, I just feel like it's such an important one. You know, I think there's this air of inevitability about the technologies that sort of just like appear in our lives, and there's an Apple keynote and suddenly the world has shifted to iPhones, and there's just this really, I think, it's like a profound ruse in a way of this sense of inevitability around the way that we live with the tools that we have. And I know Stephanie talks about this so eloquently about the kind of almost accidental situation of our universe with technology, such that a small group of homogenous people are the ones who essentially, for the last 100 years, at least in terms of electronic and digital technology, are the ones who get to actually define the boundaries and the potentials of all of the machines that kind of surround us right now. And that's, it's a really, you know, I mean, to call it unfortunate, it's a radical understatement. It's actually nearly criminal. But for that to be the kind of guiding force for what sort of defines the boundaries of technology is something that we're, you know, all living with. And what I love about Stephanie's work also is the fact that she's so actively challenging us to reconsider that kind of sense of inevitability. And that also is something that makes me feel very positive about how technology can be reimagined. For example, one of our artists in our last fellowship round, Xin, designed a collaborative, essentially like an alternative to Slack and other kind of online tools. But the whole notion was that she would build this tool first in conversation with the communities that would be using it. And it was a very widely varied group of communities that normally is not necessarily involved in the practice of invention. And that led to essentially almost a constitution of care for the development of each of the elements of that tool. And consent, it was designed at the speed of consent, is the way that she would phrase it. And to see that kind of project develop, and the time that it took, or the time that she took, and actually hearing from the communities that would use it in what they needed to feel safe in using this technology, it led to something that looked like the technology we had, but was much more thoughtful and was also radically different. And I think there's an approach to building technology that takes us to a better place than the one that we're at. And that to me is, that has an intentionality behind it that I see more and more artists really building from. And I think that is one of the more exciting kind of paths, you know, forward around technology actually being a tool that can have positive outcomes that benefit the world rather than just a few. And yeah, so I'll just leave it at that.
Wow, I love that, Roddy. You know, it's really interesting because for as much as I use technology is not my core at all. And I think that this idea that artists can lead through the work that they're doing with technology, and that we're working to kind of see the world differently. And I always think about modeling because once we do this thing that we do, like the system, right, that works kind of like a Slack, but is very different because of the way it's made, we've modeled the thing that we're often told is impossible, right? And that's the thing I hear an awful lot. It's like, oh no, you can't, that's not, it's like, no, that's just not commercially viable, perhaps, but I think that it is possible. And the question of how we investigate that is really important. And artists doing that is an amazing thing. And getting back to my full circle, you know, I've come to the conclusion with all the tech work I've done that our stories are our algorithms, right? We've used story for millennia to instruct ourselves in how to live and do things and survive. And those are still with us, and we are able to access them, whether we're accessing them and pushing them out into the world verbally, or whether we're doing that in a way that is more technological. I don't think matters that much, except for the findability of it, like the revisiting nature of it and who it has access to. And that's really only because we're still not that great with the intangible, right? And those things that we can't really name in a hard way. But the tech is secondary. It's really interesting. I did a web VR installation piece, and people were like, but what's the AR? What's the AI here? I'm like, I don't really care, right? It's about the story, and it's about giving you these stories. There is some AI in here if you really want to find it. But if we can't hear each other's stories, what do we have? And if we can't respect, honor, and care for each other's stories, I don't see how we go forward.
This sets us up perfectly to start to move into kind of our final thoughts for the evening. And I really want to sort of come back to this idea that we might have started our conversation around the idea of aesthetics and ethics, and sort of certainly thinking about the moving at the speed of both trust and consent. But I think what came really to mind for me is the way that these are often intimate sort of ways of expressing long-held knowledge of people in place that we choose to sort of intentionally bring back and call into being. And we might use technology to do that, and we might bring others along with this, but I think that was my takeaway of all the things that everyone sort of said and shared tonight. So with that, I'm going to open it up for final thoughts, starting with Salome.
Yeah, just with closing, I guess I'm thinking about how old this field or community of practice is of media arts. You know, it definitely predates the internet, is 60, if not 70 years plus old. And so just what maybe is missing and what we should, you know, continue to invest in is writing, right? Is criticism, is something that helps connect the dots and find the edges of this work to help us, you know, understand the language. And then, you know, I'm thinking, just want to plus one, something that has been said continuously throughout this call, of just making and building unlikely partnerships. You know, I'm thinking about a project where I, you know, worked with a historic Black legacy institution in Pittsburgh, August Wilson Center, and partnered with Carnegie Mellon University students, robotics students, to do a project. And after leaving, that's a relationship that still exists. And that's so exciting to me that, you know, they're sharing resources and knowledge. And so, yeah, looking for unlikely partners in this work.
Let's see. You know, I don't know. I sit here and just think, I'm thinking a lot about collaborative consent lately, and wondering where that gets, which means like, how do we partner? How do we come together to start to define things in ways that we agree on and want to carry forward, and indeed trust, right? That becomes my biggest question, and hopefully some projects that I will be doing in the future are going to start to massage that information, and thinking about what technologies we use to do that, and what historic modalities that we bring in that have always existed to inform that. And do the work on its own as well. So I'm thinking about that space in between, right? And how we mine it and how we bring it forward and make it possible and useful for not just ourselves, but for so many. And I'm going to say useful, but also possible, right? Like opening up that site of possibility and probability. And for me, that's often figuring out ways to enter spaces, maybe through a side door or a back door or some way unusual that allows those who are not necessarily correctly prepared to do the work, to get into it, because they're capable of doing the work. It's just about understanding first how you get that foot wet, start working in it, and then like, what's the innovation that comes out of that? Yeah.
I think I'm just going to pick up on the idea of the transmission line. So if I think about the ways in which people move through space and place, and I think about, the intricate river systems that lead into lake systems that then lead into oceans that allow us to transverse across the entire space. And they were, in fact, the transmission lines of that now we use fiber optics. And so I think about, not only does that kind of have a long trajectory in history, but it actually is a way of communicating. And I think that, our way forward will be really thinking about what do those transmission lines look like, whose voices are sitting there and communicating through those lines, and what kind of important stories are we going to be listening to in the future and beyond that.
That's great. Roddy?
Not sure how I can follow all that up, but I guess I would just quickly say, the thing that I'm really thinking a lot about these days is this question of policy, especially as it relates to technology. And it just seems like we have a window that's closing, but it's still open for cultures, for nations, for the world to decide what we want technology to be and what we want it to do for us, versus technology essentially extracting us in service of profit, and also literally extracting resources from the earth and leading to increased climate change in a very real manner. And it sometimes it's very it's not the happiest note perhaps to end the conversation tonight on, but it's really terrifying sometimes to think about what technology in its current trajectory and in its current speed is going to become without governments. I don't know who else could do it. Governments stepping in and actually regulating some components of both the psychological extraction as well as the physical extraction of current machines that are sort of powering the world. And I do see shifts in that, so that gives me some sense of hope. But I guess that would be my sort of closing thought, is I would just encourage everyone to think about how they could be a force, whether you're interested in the art component or the creativity component or not, but how you could be a voice that helps guide your local or national or international even policy around relationships to technology, so that we can get to a more ecological and equitable relationship to the machines that power our lives.
Anne-Marie?
To kind of bring this back more locally to Detroit, for those cultural center institutions that are still on here, I think we all have a lot to be proud of with the work that we're doing together on the Cultural Center Planning Initiative. The fact that we've developed a homegrown, cooperative, and place-based model to build a culture of collaboration and trust that ultimately will help us all become more connected, a much more connected district. And at the same time, that helps all of our institutions to become more porous and more welcoming to all people that come here. I'm especially proud with the support that we've received from the Knight Foundation and from the Ralph Wilson Jr. Foundation in helping to create a new Wi-Fi system for this district. A big technology project that we're doing ourselves without the help of someone like AT&T or Sprint, that we're using the strength of our institutions to build this. So thanks to Wayne State University for that. But I just kind of want to remind, kind of building off of some of the question that Matt had asked earlier, we have a lot of power together locally to work together and cooperate to build something that welcomes people to this area, that brings more resources and finance to this area. And I just want to remind our partners that we have each other here to kind of work together. And we have a lot more to do moving forward. But I'm just very hopeful from having heard everything, that from having heard what all of the panelists said tonight, that we're on the right path. We're making good progress. It is slow as hell, but we're doing it. So I just want to thank all of our panelists tonight for participating in this really great Transformer talk. I was just absolutely mesmerized. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we are nearly done. It is my job to say, save the date for our next one. Our fifth talk is coming up. It's going to be on the power of piloting, which is really around how do you sort of see and show and grow what has been working. We're really pleased to have joining us Katie Moffat, who's head of digital at the Audience Agency. They are based in London, and they're a consultancy that has been working with some of the major cultural institutions in the UK on their digital transformation strategy, including really trying to map this kind of hybrid digital physical journey that most of our audiences and visitors are going on. And then equally, we're really pleased to have Sean Lonnie with us, who's the founding director of the Exploratorium Studio for Public Spaces, who is also an artist who works in technology as well as landscape, and has commissioned some incredible works that sit at the intersection of STEM and science learning and incredible technology in public place. So with that, we have a few more speakers to confirm, but we will see you next time on June 16th, 5 o'clock. Thank you so much. This has been the Transformer series. Thank you again to all of our panelists. We are so excited that you were here. This was an amazing conversation. Take care. We'll see you again.